I'd like to ask Richard Florida and Joel Kotkin to please come up and join me and help me give them a great Kansas City welcome. All right, brother. Have a seat right there.
You don't care?
Right in there.
Okay.
So, Joel is known as an uber geographer. And Richard, some of your gloss is what you're our country's top urbanist. Is that right?
I hope so.
I hope so, okay. Well, last night, we went to dinner. You haven't been to Kansas City, what, Richard, 15, 16 years?
Mm-hmm.
Joel, you're in and out of here every so often. I know you're speaking in Overland Park in about a month, right? So you have some familiarity with KC. I would say this. What do you think of our KC After Dark tour? And I bet you thought we were going to go have dinner at a barbecue restaurant or steak, but I surprised you with sushi, did I not? What's your take on Kansas City? Joel?
Well, I think Kansas City, I've been here several times. What it has, first of all, as somebody who's spent most of his life in Los Angeles, you can actually get from here to there. That's a big plus. So, and I mean this in a serious way, because if you live in Overland Park and you want to go downtown, you can do it. If you want to live downtown and work in Overland Park, you can do it. Many times in many parts of this country, you have to choose, really make a choice. I can live urban or I can live suburban, and then people are really forced to make choices that maybe they don't want to make. So I was very impressed. I'll tell you what I liked the most. I think Richard would probably back me up on this. I love those neighborhoods that we went through. I thought, I mean, you know, the Power and Light District and the other stuff, I've seen those. I've seen them in lots of cities. What your real strength is your neighborhoods, and those great neighborhoods that are growing organically, which I hopefully will eventually also be family-friendly neighborhoods.
We moved from Westwood, Westport, River Market, all throughout. Rich, you take.
Well, yeah, you know, when I came here 15 or 16 years ago, when I initially wrote Rise of the Creative Class, and this group brought me here to really talk about how to attract people, not just investment, but people, and how to bring especially young people, attract the young people that you're having your schools and retain people here. You know, I thought you had great suburbs. I think even with the Country Club Plaza and all the suburban areas where many of you live are spectacular. And at that time, I think what I said was, you have to put your effort, because people come in all shapes and sizes, all age groups. There's family-friendly communities, but there's got to be a community that's friendly for younger people. And I think I was more than amazed. I was taken aback in that abbreviated time frame, what you've accomplished in the downtown, the quality of the hotel we're staying at, the neighborhoods and districts, how, as Joel said, they've alighted, and how that whole continuum going out from downtown to where we ate last night has really become, and it's not just young people. You know that I said this to you. I said, you know what I see? You have a safe inner city, you have a safe urban core, because I not only see young singles walking around, I see young families with young children standing in front of the restaurant. So I think the thing that's really struck me, and I was talking to a friend today, you may know him, who moved here from Silicon Valley to take a job to the Kauffman Foundation. It was nice to reunite. And he said something I thought, but I didn't say to you. I thought it last night. When I wrote Rise of the Creative Class, a community that I focused on that was doing it right at that time, but now has many challenges, was Austin, Texas. And I said to myself, what he said, moving here from the Valley, boy, this feels a lot like, not only in terms of its energy, but in terms of its built environment, its storefronts, its neighborhoods. It feels a lot like what Austin, Texas felt to me 15 or 16 years ago. And I felt that last night, and I'm happy to share it with you now.
Joel, I know you do a lot of work in Texas.
Yes.
Houston, Dallas, Fort Worth, even Austin. What's your take on
Well, I think in Texas, we have a report coming out from the Center for Opportunity Urbanism about what we call the Texas way of urbanism. And I think if you want to look at where people are moving, where jobs are being created, I think Texas is pretty much in the lead in most of those areas. But what I like most about Texas is, first of all, people are really unpretentious. And what I really like, besides the barbecue and the Tex-Mex, is the fact that they have embraced the idea that you have these two different kinds of markets. if you go to Houston or Dallas, the inner ring is all sorts of exciting things, and that used to be a complete dead zone, and now it's come back. But what's interesting is they continue to build further out, building communities. And one of the things I think that I like most about Texas is that young people can go at age 30, 35, buy a house. Minorities, immigrants, they can go buy a house. What disturbs me as a Californian, even with my New York accent, is after 40 years I have a right, is that now it's become so expensive for somebody coming in today that their chances of owning a house, starting a business, moving forward, has begun to diminish. And that's why I think this is this tremendous opportunity for cities like Kansas City to come in and say, we have an alternative. We've got the suburban stuff, we've got the urban stuff, and you know what? You could actually afford it.
I want to build on what Joel said, because first of all, I just want to comment that Joel and I have been in the dialogue now for nearly 20 years. And sometimes we debate, and sometimes he's my critic, but there is no other urbanist in the world that I've learned more from than Joel Kotkin, and that is the God's truth.
Thank you.
His work, even when we debate and go mano a mano, is really pushed my own thinking, much more than many of the so-called academic urbanists. So I just want to say to Joel personally how much he's influenced my work. I want to take up this idea of the expensive cities and expensive metros. You know, when I wrote Rise of the Creative Class, I could not have predicted, and Mayor James, when I sit with your colleagues from New York City, Mitch Landrieu from New Orleans, Manny Diaz from Miami, Martin O'Malley from I could go down the list. I saw them at Mike Bloomberg's City Lab meeting. Every single one of those mayors said, we could not have predicted. We wanted gentrification. We wanted back to the city. We wanted your creative class, but boy, are we in a pickle. And so I'm writing a new book. It's out in April. It's called The New Urban Crisis. I promise if you want me, I'll come back and talk about it if you'd like to have me. But one of the things I found in that book is we don't have an old urban crisis of decline anymore. We have a new urban crisis of maybe too much success, with all of these people packing into Los Angeles or New York. But I want to pick up on Texas, because I think Texas is an illustrative case. And Joel knows this because we talked about it. Texas has done many things right. It has promoted development at the periphery. But alongside, now, New York, Los Angeles, and San Francisco are experiencing this the worst. But right in that top 10 of large metros are Houston, Dallas, and Austin. San Antonio's doing a little better in terms of inequality, hyper-gentrification. We're talking about housing prices in Houston. So what I want to echo is the opportunity for metros at your size range of Kansas City, of Nashville. And we could go down a list that we did of your competitors. And I think Joel and I echo this. The ability to provide an affordable, livable, quality of place option is, I think, your real opportunity, because it's not a limited, that urban crisis is expanding, and it's almost engulfing many of those metros, say over 5 and 6 million. So I think that's your opportunity point. How do you compete? And you said your competition for investment. I think equally, I would encourage you to the competition for people and talent, and not just young people. I want to echo this. It's people of all parts of that age range, young people, people with families, and empty nesters.
Right. I just one thing. First of all, Richard, thank you for your comments. You know, and I've obviously learned a lot in our back and forth. I think maybe some truth comes out of it in the long run.
I think you're right.
But I think that what's really important for Kansas City today, and cities all over, is you start looking at the demographics. We've both been looking at where are young people going? Where are people 25 to 34 with a college education? Where are they going? Before 2010, they were pretty much going to the cities Richard was highlighting in his books. That has really changed. There are now more people, for instance, of college-educated 25, 34, moving to Cleveland from Brooklyn than the other way around. We're beginning to see a real change, and I think the opportunity for Kansas City has never been greater because, you know, frankly, you know, us older guys, you know, I got into the LA real estate market in 1980. So I was able to buy a house for $150,000 and ride that wave to where I live now in Orange County. That isn't going to be available to my kids. And where are my kids going to look for opportunity? It's going to be places like Kansas City.
Before we get to some questions from the crowd, you're known as a suburbanist and you're an urbanist, but you've written a lot of late how those lines are blurring. Could you talk on that, and then we'll get going with our questions?
I think when we grew up, and we started to debate and dialogue. And actually, Joel wrote a book called The New Geography, where he was one of the first people to predict this back to the city movement. The lines between urban and suburban were great. Urban areas were in decline. They had a hole in the donut. They had poverty. And suburban areas where the middle class went and where business went. And then we saw, and people call this, it's inaccurate, it has a certain accuracy, they called it a great inversion. That all the, and it's true, richer people have, younger, more affluent white people have been the people who are most likely to move back to a city are in the top 10% of the income distribution. Precisely as Joel said, because the housing prices in these places are expensive. What's happened, and you see it in KC, don't you? You don't have to go anywhere else to see it. The urban areas have become safer. Look, there's still a long way to go. Schools across the board need to be better, but they've become more family friendly, at least maybe for people with strollers. Certainly if you look at New York, green space, waterfront, the ability to walk around with very little fear compared to when we were growing up. The suburban areas have invested in walkability, mixed-use development. We had dinner in a suburban area last night. They've become more urban, and I think what people are wanting, and maybe we actually, all of us live this way, is to live in an area that you call the best of both. But I actually think these words don't have as much traction as they did before. I don't know what the new word is, but the idea that there's an urban and a suburban, it seems to me that those lines are blurring, and the very best communities, if you will, the ones that are really going to be successful, have elements of both.
I just want to emphasize, Richard is very right that when you look at the inner cores of many cities, that's where wealthy, well-educated people are going. But we have to remember the vast majority of even cities, and the overwhelming majority, 80, 90, 95%, depending on the metro, live outside. And I'm very concerned about what's going to happen to some of the communities in the, let's say, not maybe downtown, but neighborhoods outside. I happen to be, as a New Yorker, I'm a big walker, and I took some walks into some neighborhoods here that you didn't show me.
It was dark, and you all wanted to eat.
So, but yes. What's really important is to understand, and this is where I think we really have come together in a common concern, is while we're celebrating what's going on in the core cities and in some of the very successful suburbs, there's a huge part of this country, a huge part of this population where the neighborhoods are deteriorating, where opportunity is disappearing. And I think, frankly, that should be the highest priority of everybody in the economic development business.
You've got 30 seconds.
We'll build really quickly. Joel is absolutely right. We have not only lost the middle class in America, we have lost the middle-class neighborhoods that all of us grew up in. That I was born into in Newark, that I grew up in North Arlington, New Jersey, that you grew up in Jersey City. Listen to this statistic. The number of Americans who live in a middle-class neighborhood was 66% in 1970. It is now less than 40%. In 203 of 229 metros that you can track this, the middle class has declined. We are no longer a nation of a strong and sturdy middle class, and strong and sturdy middle class neighborhoods which push us up. We have small areas of concentrated advantage in urban and suburban, spanned by much larger areas of concentrated disadvantage. And I hope whatever happens on election day, this can become a priority. We hope that this can become a priority for our country.
We have our first question. Mike Boehm is mayor of Lenexa, and they're doing some really cool things with new urbanism there in his community. Mayor?
Good afternoon, gentlemen. Welcome to Kansas City. My question is, you've talked a lot about the major metropolitan areas, the top 10 cities population-wise. Are there examples of communities out there comparable to Kansas City which have strong suburban cities as well as a strong urban core that are working together to grow their regional economy? And if so, how are they doing that?
We've touched on a few of those, but give us some other ones.
I mean, the one that just leaps out is Nashville.
We agree.
Yeah, I mean, Nashville is a great town. There's lots to do. But as someone explained to me, 20 minutes away, I'm living on a lake in the countryside. So you have towns like Franklin that are around Nashville. Nashville's probably as good a case as any that I've seen where they've really attracted people. And this is really important for Nashville and for many of these other communities. Companies, when I talk to them, they say, look, I want to attract a 35-year-old engineer and their spouse. They make $95,000, $100,000, $150,000 a year. They can't go to Silicon Valley anymore. They want to find something that has some of the nice things about California, but they want to be able to afford a decent quality of life. And they shouldn't be forced to make the choice. I did hundreds of interviews in Brooklyn about this, where they say, I either can have a family, own a home somewhere else, or stay in Brooklyn. A city and a region shouldn't make people make that choice. And places like Nashville, and I'm sure Richard has some other examples as well, are doing a really good job of that.
I want to say you. And the reason is, I actually looked at my statistics this morning. I was sick and tired of the book, but I pulled up the Excel spreadsheet for your own rank on this new urban crisis index, which shows inequality levels, economic and racial segregation levels, levels of housing unaffordability. Of the 50 or so metro areas over 1 million, I can't remember all, there's so many rankings, trust me, you'll be bored to tears if you looked at them, but they were all between 40 and 50. So you were in the upper tier, even Nashville was experiencing this much more. So I think you have this great opportunity where you have had urban revival, you've have a comeback, you have these great suburbs, but you also are not paralyzed by some of these problems of inequality and unaffordability. So I think looking to yourselves, and also benchmarking against the Nashvilles and others, but I think you have a very compelling case of a place that's doing it right, growing without experiencing some of these very difficult problems.
Last night at dinner, we talked about transit and how important that is. Joe Reardon is president of our regional chamber. He was a very successful mayor in Wyandotte County, Kansas City, Kansas for 8 years, and also ran the Regional Transit Authority and taught Robbie Makinen everything he knows about regional transit. Joe?
Thank you, Tim, and it's great to have you gentlemen here with us today for this conversation. What does a regional transit system look like in the future for urban and suburban environments? And then what can cities do within a region to connect that together and create a regional transit system that answers both?
Well, I'm studying this right now. First of all, I think it depends on the region. I grew up in New York. I rode trains for most of my young life. Went to Met games on the subway and all that. New York is unique. About 50% of all the train commuters in America are in the greater New York area. Cities that grew before 1950, the train system works pretty well. Where we see a problem is when cities that are growing and are more spread out already, you can't re-engineer it. How do you do a transit system that works? I can tell you here in Los Angeles, where we have better weather than you and many times your density, we spent $16 billion on rail systems, and the share of people taking transit has dropped. What I think innovative regions that want to move forward are going to have to look at the new technologies. Uber and Lyft are just the beginning. Autonomous vehicles, dial-a-ride. I've talked to mayors, a wonderful mayor of Anaheim, California, who basically stopped a project to build $300 million trolley system between their train station and Disneyland when he found out that there are only a handful of people taking it every day. So we have to start thinking about how do we use new technologies. One, obviously what we have in terms of dial-a-ride. We can take people to their homes and from their homes. What transit works best is in an area with a lot of jobs are concentrated in one place. New York, Chicago. In a place like Kansas City where your job base is spread out, I think you should look at innovative effects. And I spoke to the GAO a couple of weeks ago, and I said, the federal government ought to go to Kansas City and other cities and say, here's a bunch of money, you figure out how to do it. Don't tell us how to do it because it may not fit our model.
I think you have, at your current population base, over 2 million. I think you told me it was about 2.4 million in your region, the way you define it. You have about 3 million people that you can add before you get to a crisis point of a Toronto or an Atlanta or a Miami or a Los Angeles. So you have time, but I think thinking about it now, the one thing I want to address in addition to what Joel said is, I think Joel mentioned his walking around the city, bicycling. I think these very simple, cheap modes of transportation, encouraging more people to think about living closer to work. These are the simplest ways, and actually when you ask people where they get true joy out of their life, they get joy from walking and riding a bicycle. One thing that came up last night that we were remiss not to talk about, we were talking about drivers of economic development, and one is high technology clusters, another is talented people, we could go on. But the third one that we all agreed was airport.
Yes.
And one of the things that's driving the economic spikiness or concentration is the fact that many people are locating their companies around these substantial hub airports. Now, we don't have an answer for your airport situation, and we know it's complicated, but thinking about how the airport factors into your growth future has to be an important part of your economic development strategy.
And just to amplify that, there are some really good case studies. Dallas, DFW is what drives Dallas. That's why a company, you could have a global company out of Dallas or Houston and get anywhere you want to go. That's a huge advantage. I know when we talk about where we would live, it has to be someplace where I can get places. I don't want to keep changing planes. A very important example of a city more your size is Denver.
Yeah.
Denver, they called it Peña's Folly. Turned out to be a brilliant move. And one last thing about transportation, the most important and innovative thing going on is people working at home. I know the office people might not like my talking about it, but I can tell you that in almost every metropolitan area in America outside of a few cities, more people work at home than take transit, and it's growing, it's family friendly. When you talk to developers, they're building houses with that space. And by the way, environmentally, it's one of the best solutions we have.
How much would we have to pay you to come up with an answer for our airport situation? Is there
Our
a
team
sum
can
of money?
negotiate that.
I think Joe and I would like that.
No doubt about it. Thank you.
Now we have Erica Moody, who's a principal of a really hot design architecture firm. And she's got a question. Erica, thanks.
Thanks for your time today. We touched on this a little bit, but what are the trends that you're seeing as young professionals and millennials who live in the urban environment are getting older and starting their families?
Well, it's better than the alternative. Yeah, and I think it's going to be more of a factor. I do a lot of work in demographics, and one of the things I think that's happening is that the millennial generation by 2018 will be more over 28 than under 28. The next 20 years, the big growth bulge will be in their 30s. I think the period, and I think Richard was prescient in identifying this, there was this huge surge of millennials. Let's face it, when you're young, you don't really care where you live, you don't know where you're going to sleep anyway, and you want to be near the bars, and after 5 or 6 drinks, you stagger home. You get into your 30s, I don't know about you, but I can't handle that many drinks, and you start to want different things. So I think it's going to be really interesting is how do we evolve urban neighborhoods that can accommodate these people as they get older, and suburban neighborhoods to be able to provide with the kind of walking experience, retail experience that they want.
And I think that's the preference. It's for a neighborhood that's walkable, that's mixed use, that has the things you need. You don't have to commute an incredibly arduous time. You can work at home, you can work in a coffee shop. And where you see the real tremendous value, if you will, is in the older, my wife is from Detroit. And Detroit has had some movement back to the core. And there's been a lot of investment in the core. But when you look at young people, the real high housing prices that they're bidding for are from Ferndale, outside the city, to Royal Oak, where the slightly younger people go, to the Birmingham area, all which are these older, walkable suburbs where housing prices have really risen because there's a shortage of such neighborhoods. But I do see this preference for a new kind of lifestyle that is much more blended. And it's kind of what urbanists have always talked about. Sometimes they've talked about it like Greenwich Village or Georgetown as the examples, forgot that these great suburbs had the same thing, but I think that's what people are looking for. The other one that I just want to mention, I'd say there are 3 big moves. The one you do after college, the one you do not when you get married, but when the kids come along, but then the empty nester. The empty nester one is very interesting, especially since so many of the young people depend on their parents in this environment. My students at the University of Toronto said the only way we can buy a house is if we go to the bank of mom and dad. So I think these joint moves are very interesting with parents of millennials, and millennials sometimes staying apart, but sometimes the parents are actually following them and locating around them. So I think those 2 things are the interesting moves to look at.
Yeah, there's some developers who are actually building the add-on units, and not just for the kids, but also for aging parents. You could be 60 years old and one of your or both of your parents, if you're really lucky, are in their 80s. and you build a unit for them. So when I was visiting Irvine, when we were looking to buy, a lot of smart developers are building those units. Originally, they thought they would be for the granny flat, but now they've become the kid flat.
Erica, thank you. We have an amazing program in Kansas City called KC Scholars, Kauffman Foundation funds. And we have a young lady who is graduating from UMKC here in May, and Autumn Bryant is going to ask you a question.
Good afternoon to you both. We are very excited for you to be here. And my question for you is, how do you all think that cities can create an environment that actually promotes the workforce to want to stay in that environment?
City meaning the inner city?
The city as a total, so like Kansas City in general, for the workforce to stay in urban communities and for in suburban communities.
How can we create an environment to stay in our region?
Well, I think you're doing a lot of it now, but what you want to do is you want to have safety. Safety is number one, good schools is number two, and then having these walking environments. One of the things that developers have been telling me a lot now is the day of, I'm going to offend some other people, I guess. Golf is sort of on the way out as a.
You're right.
It takes too much water, it takes too much space. Young people don't have the time for it. They'd rather have a bike trail or a hiking trail, whether it's in the city or in the suburbs. So like the new suburban developments that are being built, the new things that Irvine's doing, the new things that are being done by Newland out at Cinco Ranch, a lot of urban communities. My neighborhood, we have a path along a creek, and I ride my bike to school. It's pretty neat. And in that town of Orange, which you saw, which is quite charming. And I think that's what you're going to have to look to. And I think one place where I think Richard and I are in some surprising agreement is this idea of let's build gigantic blocks of housing, turning what were organically nice neighborhoods into something that looks out of the Soviet Union is probably not such a good idea.
So a couple things. I think, and I mentioned this for KCAD, you're focused on attracting investment and retaining businesses, making talent attraction and retention a part, and you are, but making that explicitly part of your mission is important, and you've done it. But talent comes in both genders, all family types, all races and ethnicities. So thinking about the different things that different kinds of people need. One big move comes after college. You are a big college town. So really working with the college and university students through internship. We see a lot of architects and designers staying where they went to school.
Right.
Why? Because they have internships and experiences in those communities. The tech kids go to San Francisco or Austin. So working with the universities to do that, making sure, as Joel said, that as families get older, as families form and people get older, they can see the options for where to go. But the one thing we also agree on, what's driving growth in America's metros is immigrants.
Yeah.
and your universe, it's no longer Ellis Island where my grandparents came through. Many immigrants are coming through the university and college systems. John Doerr, the venture capitalist, said every kid who graduates Stanford should have a green card stapled to his diploma. But the point is working with those immigrant communities to attract them. And I think when we look at communities in your size range, we were talking about this last night, the real successes are the ones that have not only kept their young people and attracted more, been great, but they've really attracted masses of immigrants. So I think thinking about workforce retention and attraction across the varied parts and developing a strategy to address it.
Just one little example. I was in Nashville, and you expect country music and barbecue. This guy's driving me around. There's a little Somalia, there's a little Kurdistan, there's a little Mexico. In Nashville, where I live, Orange County, very similar in many ways to Johnson County. We are the most heavily Asian county of over 2 million in the country. So, because immigrants, as we discussed, more likely to have families. They don't come to America to live in the kind of housing they had when they lived in Singapore or Hong Kong. They come for the American dream. And so I think that the immigrants are absolutely critical. As the Kauffman Foundation showed up, they're much more entrepreneurial, much more innovative, because you know what? When my grandparents came about the same time, mine from Russia, his from Italy. When they came in with their own bizarre ideas, and you know what? My grandmother couldn't get a job at a big store because they weren't hiring our kind.
Yeah.
And so they had to come up with other ways of doing things. So the outsiders are absolutely critical, have always been critical in urban history. And so I think that that's something that is really going to be critical for Kansas City, because you're not showing that yet in the numbers that I think you'd like to see.
So one thing, you mentioned Nashville, and it's very interesting as a comparable community. Strategically, music. There's a lot of other things about that economy, healthcare and logistics, which are very important, but music. And you think about why that was successful. Well, they had a base of music, they had a big media presence with the Grand Ole Opry, but it is really hard to have a band in an expensive city. Think about this. If you're playing rock and roll music, you cannot do that with a band of 4 and 5 guys in your apartment. You need practice space, you need studio space, and you need that soundproof because you're practicing in through the wee hours in the morning. Well, what did they have available? In a downtown core that was not revitalized, they had a lot of cheap space. And when you go to those studios, you're almost amazed. You go to this crappy old house or this old garage, and it's a state-of-the-art studio. The point is to think about, especially where space, building assets can be used. You know, if you just need a laptop to do something, space isn't that important. But if you require more space and a little bit of quiet, so I think they tailored a strategy to the kinds of thing they were likely to pick off from the LAs, the New Yorks, and the other big metros.
We're getting close towards the end. Autumn, thank you for that question. Thanks for being here, and good luck to you in your career search. Davion Ross, good friend of mine. He could not be here today. He is an entrepreneur. He's probably out doing another deal with Magic Johnson or Klay Thompson. I had a question about what are the top 3 innovations that Kansas City regional communities should be thinking about over the next decade to accelerate our growth. We're really concerned about our growth rate here. We want to grow faster. Rich, why don't you take that one first?
Well, there's another great urbanist who influenced both of us, who when I moved to Toronto, I was able to become friends with her, Jane Jacobs. And when 9/11 happened, because there's another New Yorker, I'm from New Jersey, I talk like this, but that's a time for another thing. I asked Jane, I said, what can we do together, Jane, to help rebuild that site? And she said, so sweet, Richard, I don't mean to tell you this, but you've asked the wrong question. How do we empower the business owners of that site? How do we work with the residents, the transit commuters? So I think the number one innovation would be to empower the neighborhoods and the community. The best companies in the world, and they don't have an edict from on high, they have teams of workers that make those shop floor improvements. I think thinking about not only business investment, but we live in a people-driven, talent, whatever word you want to call it, thinking about the people component, and I do think really thinking long and hard about transport, anticipating as you know the success you will have. But I have to say again, echoing, thinking really long and hard about that airport and being very innovative about how you redo that airport and how you forge connections. You know, it's very funny, we're talking about where I live part of the year in Toronto. Air Canada, I have a direct flight because Air Canada subsidizes flights to many jurisdictions around the world so that Toronto has a connection to these places. I'm not saying you should do that, but thinking long and hard about the kinds of places you need connected fiber to through air.
Air travel, air service.
Well, I agree with most of it. One very important idea, and it's very contrary to what unfortunately is happening in my home state, is allow the communities to express themselves. If one community, let's say in Johnson County, says, we want to be the office density hotel center, let them do it. But if another community says, hey, you know what, we like our quasi-rural way of life, let them do it. Make choices. Let communities make choices. Don't have a group of people on the top saying, you are going to fit this role. It is the diversity of your communities that is your strength.
I want to just reinforce that. Jane Jacobs also said to me that great regions are federations of neighborhoods, all different kinds. And Joel, your most recent work on this is really important, that having a region, you said suburban, urban, but within that there's so many different ones at different levels of density. Having this ability for a individual, consumer choice, for you to have choice where you want to be, I think is very important. Letting all of this community input and community differentiation bloom, creating a great division of labor is really important.
Very good. Our final question from my boss, my incoming co-chair, Rosie Privatera Biondo. Rosie.
Joel, Richard, thanks again for being here. And my question is, what are the advantages of being a heartland Midwest city, and which markets do you think KC competes with?
Well,
Rich, take that.
you're in the center of one of the largest markets in the world. So from a logistics, there's a reason Amazon and others are here and Google came. You're in the middle of a place that you're in the middle of the Midwest, which is, look, climate change is going to affect all of us, but you're not Miami or New York, or you're not a coastal city, so you are buffeted from that kind of thing. You're in the middle of the country, but I do want to say one other thing in terms of your future. You know, you have the Kauffman Foundation here, which has done so much important things as a think tank for entrepreneurship. When Joel went to Houston, they invested in a think tank for opportunity urbanism. I think one of the things you could do is begin to become a center not only of practice, but of thinking and doing, really creating a center. Now, Cleveland has done some of this, Pittsburgh, where you see, but thinking about, you call it opportunity urbanism. We have a similar thing in Toronto. But thinking about what kind of think tank you could look at the example of Kansas City and other similar communities, what works on the ground, but what are these mega trends that are shaping it? So I think coming up with the kind of the vision and the narrative and the strategic assets broadly to market your mission, but also to think about this would be an important way of grappling with and understanding and pioneering this new Midwest.
Joel, what would you add to that? We'll wrap up.
Do it quick. I know we're about to get the hook, but
Sorry, I apologize.
but the key thing here is you're in the part of an enormously rich region with enormously rich history. Embrace who you are. The work that you do with animals, with agriculture, the logistics. This is what is natural to you. You want to stick to your basic DNA. You want to remain friendly. You want to be a place that thinks about, and I've been looking for this for years. I have a big paper coming out on the heartland early next year. Somebody has to take the leadership of Middle America. There's the way the world is going, neither the East Coast or the West Coast is going to absorb the next generation. They simply can't do it. Or, frankly, they don't want to do it. They don't want any more people. But, have a proposition in Los Angeles, would you like another 500,000 people? Oh, about 98% of the people will say no, because it's crowded enough. This is a strategic opportunity for the middle of the country. You've got affordability, and you can do things right. And if you stick to your DNA and you stay true to who you are, I think you have a great future.
It's a great way to wrap up. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your insight. Thank these guys. Thanks, brother. Appreciate it, man. Thanks, man. Appreciate it. All right.